Barron Trump sat calmly at the table, his expression composed, his posture relaxed yet confident. At 18, he was no longer the quiet child the world had once glimpsed from afar. Tonight was different. This was his first live television appearance. And while he had been hesitant at first, something about the conversation intrigued him. He had spent his life being spoken about. Rarely had he been given the chance to speak for himself. The conversation started smoothly, the host asking general questions about growing up in the public eye. Barron answered with ease, his voice steady but thoughtful. The panel seemed pleasantly surprised. He was articulate, self-aware, and carried himself with a quiet maturity. Then came the shift. One of the commentators, a well-known political analyst, leaned forward slightly. His tone was sharp, calculated, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. "Let's be honest, Barron," he said with a slight smirk. "Your life has been nothing but privilege. You've never had to struggle, never had to work for anything. How can someone like you understand the real world?" The room fell silent. Even the host hesitated, glancing at Barron as if waiting to see how he would react. The question wasn't just pointed, it was designed to corner him, to make him falter under the weight of assumption. Barron didn't flinch. He met the critic's gaze, his expression unreadable. A pause stretched between them, tension thick in the air. Then, in a calm, even voice, he responded, "You think having everything makes life easy?" His eyes held something deeper than frustration, something measured, almost sad. "Sometimes the more you have, the less you get to be yourself." The critic blinked, momentarily thrown off. The audience sat in stunned silence, hanging on to his words. For the first time that night, it wasn't just another panel discussion. It was a moment. And Barron Trump had just taken control of it. The critic shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting that response. For a moment, there was an awkward pause, the kind that stretched just long enough to make everyone feel its weight. The host glanced between them, unsure whether to step in or let the moment play out. Barron, however, didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it sit, let it sink in. Then he continued, his voice even, his expression unreadable. "People assume privilege makes life simple," he said, glancing briefly toward the audience before returning his gaze to the critic. "But when you grow up with the world watching, it's not really your life anymore. Every word, every action, it belongs to someone else's narrative, someone who doesn't know you, someone who's already decided what kind of person you are." His words weren't defensive, nor were they bitter. They were factual, as if he were simply explaining something most had never stopped to consider. The room was still, waiting. "You say I've never struggled," Barron continued. "But have you ever been judged before you've even had a chance to prove yourself? Have you ever had people mock you as a child, dissect your expressions, your posture, turn you into a punchline, not because of anything you did, but because of your last name?" The critic opened his mouth, then closed it. This wasn't going the way he had expected. Barron leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the desk in front of him. "I was 10 years old when people started criticizing me for things I didn't even understand yet. Imagine growing up knowing that no matter what you do, someone, somewhere, has already made up their mind about you." A murmur spread through the audience. Even those who had come in skeptical now found themselves listening differently. "Everyone struggles," Barron said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "The difference is, some people's struggles are just easier to see." The host finally cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. "That's an interesting perspective, Barron," he said, his tone careful. Barron simply gave a small nod. "It's not a perspective. It's my life." The critic sat back, his smirk gone. The balance of power in the conversation had shifted, and for the first time, he looked like the one struggling for words. The air in the studio felt heavier now, charged with something different. It wasn't just another debate, another talking point for the news cycle. This was raw, unscripted, something real unfolding in front of everyone. The critic, who had been so sure of his stance just minutes ago, now looked unsure of how to respond. But Barron wasn't done yet. "I get it," Barron said, his tone measured but firm. "It's easy to assume that just because someone has money, their life is perfect, that they don't feel pressure, don't face expectations, don't struggle with anything real." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering his own words. "But isn't it dangerous to assume anything about someone just because of where they come from?" The critic hesitated, shifting in his seat. "I just mean—" Barron didn't let him finish. He wasn't being rude, wasn't cutting him off aggressively, but he saw the opening and took it. "No, I understand exactly what you mean," he said, his voice steady. "You think my last name defines me, and that's the same mistake people make about everyone. Someone grows up poor, You assume they'll never make it. Someone has money. You assume they don't understand hardship. But that's not how life works, is it? The audience was silent now, completely absorbed. The usual murmur of side conversations, the occasional shifting of chairs, gone. All eyes were on Barron. He let out a quiet breath, leaning forward just slightly. People talk about privilege like it's only about what you have. But what about the privilege of being unknown, of being able to fail without the entire world watching, of making mistakes without being judged by people who have never met you? The critic had no response. The tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the table. He was realizing he had walked into a conversation he hadn't fully prepared for. Barron glanced at the host, then back at the critic. I don't expect you to understand what it's like growing up in my shoes, but I won't pretend I understand yours either. And that's the difference between us right now. The critic opened his mouth again, but for the first time in his career, words seemed to fail him. The audience, recognizing the shift in power, did something no one expected. They clapped. The applause was brief, but unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of orchestrated reaction you see in political debates or rehearsed interviews. It was real. A few people in the audience exchanged glances, as if processing what had just happened. Even the host, who had likely expected a much different segment, looked mildly surprised. Barron didn't react to the clapping. He wasn't here to win an argument. He wasn't here to prove anything. He had simply told the truth, and now, the weight of that truth was settling in the room. The critic exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. All right, he said finally, his voice quieter than before. I'll admit, I wasn't expecting that answer. Barron gave a small nod, waiting. The critic cleared his throat. But let's talk about something else. If you say life in the spotlight isn't easy, then why not step away? You could disappear from public view if you wanted to. Focus on your own life. Avoid the scrutiny. Why stay in it? Barron considered this, his fingers lightly tapping against the edge of the desk. Because disappearing doesn't change who I am, he said simply. It doesn't erase my last name. It doesn't erase people's assumptions. So instead of running from it, I choose to be here. I choose to define myself on my own terms, not someone else's. The critic's expression shifted slightly, as if something in Barron's words had struck a chord. You assume I want attention? Barron continued, his voice thoughtful. But have you ever considered that I just want a voice? That I don't want my entire life to be decided by people who have never met me? The audience was completely still again. This wasn't the kind of response they had expected from him. It wasn't polished, wasn't robotic. It was raw, honest, and it was working. The host cleared his throat. So, Barron, you're saying you want to be known for who you really are, not just as someone's son. Barron looked directly at him. Exactly. The critic didn't have a quick rebuttal this time. He seemed to be choosing his words more carefully now, realizing that this wasn't just some scripted back and forth. And at that moment, everyone watching, whether in the studio or at home, realized something too. Barron Trump wasn't just answering questions. He was changing the conversation. The conversation had taken a turn no one expected. What had started as a subtle attempt to corner Barron had transformed into something else entirely. The energy in the studio was different now, less confrontational, more introspective. Even the critic, who had entered the debate with full confidence, now looked like he was rethinking his approach. Barron sat calmly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to prove anyone wrong. He had simply spoken the truth, and that had been enough to shift the room. The critic leaned forward again, but this time, his tone lacked the sharpness it had carried before. So, what do you want people to know about you? If not just your last name, then what? Barron's lips pressed together in thought. This wasn't a question he had been asked often, at least not seriously. People either assumed they already knew the answer or didn't care to ask at all. Finally, he spoke. I want people to know that I see them, that I understand what it feels like to be judged before you even open your mouth, that no matter where you come from, wealth, struggle, politics, or nowhere at all, people will try to define you before you ever get the chance to define yourself. His voice didn't rise, but the weight of his words filled the space. I know what it's like to be underestimated, he continued. I know what it's like to walk into a room and feel like no one expects you to have anything meaningful to say. And I know what it's like to have to prove yourself before people are even willing to listen. The critic studied him carefully. And you think that's different from what the average person goes through? Barron met his gaze without hesitation. No, he said. I think that's exactly why I understand them. A pause. Something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't a victory or a defeat, just an understanding. The host finally broke the silence, his voice lighter than before. Well, I think it's safe to say this interview didn't go the way some people expected. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Even the critic allowed himself a small smile. For the first time that night, it didn't feel like a debate. It felt like a conversation worth having. The discussion was no longer about politics or privilege. It had become something real, something personal. Even the critic, who had started the exchange with a confident smirk, now looked at Barron with a kind of reluctant respect. The audience, once just passive spectators, had leaned in, hanging on to every word. Barron shifted slightly in his seat, glancing around the studio. He hadn't planned on this. He hadn't come here to prove a point or win anyone over. But here he was, in a conversation that had unexpectedly turned into something bigger than himself. The host cleared his throat, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Barron, you've said a lot tonight that I don't think people were expecting. But tell me, how do you handle it? The criticism, the constant public scrutiny? It can't be easy. Barron exhaled softly, considering his answer. I've had to learn that people will always have opinions, he said. Most of the time, they're not based on truth. They're based on perception, on what's easy to believe. I can't change that. The critic finally spoke again, his voice noticeably less sharp. So you just ignore it? Barron shook his head. I don't ignore it, but I don't let it define me either. At some point, you have to decide whose voice matters more, the people who think they know you, or the person you know you are. The words settled over the room like a quiet revelation. There was something disarming about the way he said it. No arrogance, no defensiveness, just a simple truth that most people, regardless of status, could relate to. The critic sat back, nodding slightly, almost to himself. There was no longer a debate here, no need for a counterpoint. For the first time, it seemed like he understood. Barron glanced toward the cameras, fully aware that millions were watching. At the end of the day, people will believe whatever they want. That's fine. But at least tonight, they heard my voice instead of someone else speaking for me. The audience, without hesitation this time, began to clap again. The host smiled, nodding in quiet agreement. For once, Barron Trump wasn't just a name. He was a person, standing on his own, and the world was finally listening. As the applause faded, the critic sat with his hands clasped together, a thoughtful expression settling on his face. He had come into this interview with assumptions, expecting an easy debate, a familiar narrative. But now, sitting across from Barron, he realized something. He had misjudged him. He let out a small breath, then finally spoke. I'll admit, he said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. I came in here thinking I already knew what you'd say. But you've made me rethink some things. Barron tilted his head slightly, waiting. The critic continued. I've spent a lot of time analyzing public figures, breaking down their words, their actions. It's my job. But maybe I've forgotten that at the end of the day, you're not just a public figure, you're a person. The words landed heavier than expected. The audience, once merely observing, now felt part of something rare, a real moment of reflection happening live on air. Barron didn't smile, didn't gloat. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he simply nodded. That's all I've ever wanted people to see. The host, sensing the weight of the exchange, spoke up. This is probably one of the most unexpected interviews we've had in a long time, he said, offering a small chuckle. I don't think anyone saw this coming. A ripple of agreement passed through the studio. Even online, social media was already lighting up. Clips of the conversation were being shared at an unprecedented speed, people debating, discussing, acknowledging that for once something different had happened on live television. The critic leaned back in his chair. So what now? He asked. Where do you go from here? Barron exhaled through his nose. Thoughtful. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know I want my name to stand for something more than just who my father is. He met the critic's gaze, unwavering. And I think, after tonight, maybe that's possible. The critic, for the first time since the interview began, smiled. Not the forced kind, not the guarded kind, just a small, real one. I think so too, he said. The cameras kept rolling, but in that moment, it wasn't about politics, fame, or debate. It was about two people who had started as opponents, and by the end, had found something much rarer, understanding. As the segment wrapped up, the studio atmosphere felt different. It wasn't just another debate, another soundbite for the news cycle. Something real had happened tonight, something that couldn't be edited down into a simple headline. Even as the cameras were still rolling, it was clear that the conversation had left an impact. Barron shook hands with the host, then, to everyone's surprise, turned to the critic and extended his hand. A pause. Then, the critic took it, giving a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that this was bigger than an argument. bigger than politics. As Barron left the stage, the buzz in the room didn't die down. It carried over into the hallways, the control room, and beyond. By the time he stepped into the black SUV waiting outside, his phone was already lighting up. Messages from friends, from people he hadn't heard from in years. Some were just simple words. Proud of you. That was incredible. Others came from unexpected places. Journalists, commentators, even people who had criticized him before. By the time he got home, the internet had exploded. Clips of the interview were everywhere, dissected from every angle. But one thing was clear. People had seen him, really seen him, for the first time. Some called it a defining moment. Others simply admitted they had misjudged him. But what mattered wasn't just the recognition. It was the shift in conversation. Barron sat in his room, phone in hand, scrolling through the reactions. He could feel the weight of it, the way a single conversation had cracked open something much larger. He had never set out to change anyone's mind. But maybe, just maybe, he had made people think twice before making assumptions about others. He put his phone down and leaned back, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow, the world would move on, as it always did. But for tonight, something had changed. Maybe this was just the beginning. If you've ever been misunderstood, judged before you even had a chance to prove yourself, then you know what this moment meant. Let's challenge assumptions. Let's listen before we decide who someone is. Because sometimes, a conversation isn't just words. It's the start of something bigger. Who's the person people assume you are? And who do you know yourself to be? Maybe it's time to show them.